In 1997, Suzuki flew the world's motorcycle press to Homestead Motorsports Complex in Florida. Smooth tarmac, warm weather, a brand new liter V-twin that was supposed to eat every Ducati on the planet. The journalists wrote it, and they raved. Cycle World put it on their 10 best list for that year. However, less than 12 months later, a customer version of that same motorcycle threw its rider headfirst into a roadside rock while his wife watched from the bike behind him. Warnings existed. They just weren't the version of the story most readers ever saw. Before we get into the bike, you need to understand the system. Motorcycle magazines in the late 1990s ran on two things: subscriptions and advertising from a tiny handful of companies. Helmet brands like Arai and Shoei, tire brands like Dunlop and Michelin, exhaust companies, and the motorcycle manufacturers themselves. Those manufacturers were also the only people on Earth who could fly your entire editorial staff to Florida to test their newest superbike. You can already see the problem. If you wrote a mean review of the wrong bike, you did not get the next invite. If you wrote a review of a bike your biggest advertiser really hated, your editor would get a phone call, and sometimes that phone call ended with someone losing a job. Access to test bikes and press events was a kind of currency. Most riders never saw the machinery in action. They saw glossy pages, cinematic hero shots, the sentence, "This is the best bike we have ever tested." But behind every one of those reviews was a conversation about what could be said, what had to be softened, and what was quietly being left on the cutting room floor. And in 1997, one of those cutting room floors belonged to a Suzuki testing facility in Japan. The bike was called the Suzuki TL1000S. On paper, it was a love letter to every rider who thought Ducati had owned the V-twin superbike market for too long. It had a 996 cubic centimeter engine arranged in a 90-degree V, a claimed 125 horsepower, an aggressive, lightweight chassis with an unusually short wheelbase and fast steering geometry, and one genuinely wild piece of engineering borrowed from Formula One racing. Because the V-twin's rear cylinder left almost no room for a conventional shock absorber, Suzuki replaced the rear shock entirely with what they called a rotary damper. Imagine a small spinning drum of hydraulic fluid trying to do the job of a full-size suspension unit in a fraction of the space. On a smooth airport-style runway, it works beautifully. On a real road, in the heat, with a rider pushing hard, that's where things start to get interesting. And by interesting, I mean terrifying. But nobody riding the TL1000S at Homestead that week in 1997 was noticing any of this. The track was glass, the weather was warm but not hot, the bikes were fresh out of the crate. Every journalist who flew home from that launch filed a version of the same review: fast, raw, raucous, a legitimate Ducati killer. Cycle World liked it enough to name it the best superbike of the year, and then the bikes started showing up in actual customers' driveways. The first hints that something was wrong showed up in rider forums and letters to British weekly magazines before most American monthlies had even finished writing their long-term reviews. Owners reported that on certain bends, at certain speeds, usually between 45 and 70 miles an hour, the front end of the TL1000S would suddenly start shaking. This was suddenly and alarming, not a wobble. A proper, violent, side-to-side oscillation, with the handlebars slapping back and forth so fast your hands could not hold on to them. Motorcyclists have a name for this. It is called a tank slapper, because the bars physically slap the fuel tank on each side. On a good day, you recover. You get lucky, the bike sorts itself out, you change your underwear at the next petrol station. On a bad day, the tank slapper rips the bars clean out of your hands, and whatever happens next is no longer really your decision. The root cause, according to virtually every motorcycle journalist and suspension engineer who investigated the bike afterward, traced back to the rotary damper. When the little spinning drum got hot, which happened almost immediately on a long, fast ride, its ability to actually damp anything degraded quickly. Combine that with the bike's short wheelbase and sharp steering, and you had a superbike that was perfectly happy to fold itself into a pretzel the moment the road got bumpy. The rotary damper performance was critical. Suzuki itself, for the record, never formally endorsed that diagnosis. Their eventual response would address the symptom, not name the cause. Inside Suzuki Europe, meanwhile, the test department had reportedly already flagged this behavior during final development. Those concerns, according to later accounts from within the industry, never made it into the launch materials, because the launch was already booked. The case that changed everything involved a British rider named Simon Carolyn Evans. He was, by every account, experienced. In early 1998, he was riding his own privately owned TL1000S to a dealership for a routine service, with his wife following on her own motorcycle a short distance behind him. The next part is her account. It was reported at length in the British motorcycle weeklies that broke the story, and later summarized in Cycle World's May 1998 feature by editor Brian Catterson, titled "Stop the Madness." Simon was rolling through a gentle bend on what you or I would consider a pretty unremarkable British country road. His speed was nothing heroic, approximately 60 miles per hour. The kind of pace where, on any normal motorcycle, you are barely even thinking about the chassis. Then, without warning, the TL1000S went into the kind of violent tank slapper we just described. This was not some small flutter or wobble. It was the full thing, instant and uncontrollable. The bars tore out of his hands, the bike bucked him clean off, and he was thrown from the motorcycle with enough force that when his head hit a large roadside rock, the impact killed him. His wife, riding the motorcycle directly behind him, watched it happen. There is no good way to write that sentence. There is no way to dramatize it that does not feel cheap. A man went on a routine ride, his motorcycle tried to kill him, and succeeded. His wife, who loved him enough to come along on a random afternoon ride, was the only eyewitness. And for a long time afterward, the only people willing to actually print the story, the full story, with names and speeds and the word "Widowmaker" in the headline, were the British weekly magazines. The American press was slower. In 1997 and 1998, the British motorcycle press was a different animal from its American cousin. Motorcycle news, performance bikes, bike, superbike. These were weekly and monthly publications with aggressive newsroom cultures, more journalism DNA than lifestyle DNA, and a long tradition of calling dangerous machines exactly what they were. When the Carolyn Evans case broke, and when owners from across Britain and continental Europe started coming forward with stories of their own high-speed weaves, the British press went nuclear. The TL1000S was on magazine covers for months. It was being labeled a widowmaker in huge block letters. Editors were publishing timeline by timeline reconstructions of crashes, photographs of bent handlebars, quotes from riders who had survived by letting the bike crash without them. And crucially, they were naming Suzuki directly, by name, on the cover for weeks. If you want to understand why coverage in the American magazines during that same period feels more measured, look at who was buying the back cover advertising. To be fair, the American press eventually caught up. Cycle World's May 1998 feature, the one that carried the widow's account, is a serious piece of reporting. But it arrived months after the British press had already dragged the story into daylight, kicking and screaming, and it arrived after Suzuki had already decided they were going to have to do something drastic to make the story stop. What Suzuki did, as quietly as they possibly could, was issue a worldwide recall. Every TL1000S, built up to that point, got a steering damper retrofitted to the front of the bike. The steering damper is exactly what it sounds like. A small hydraulic cylinder bolted across the steering head whose only job is to resist sudden violent movement of the handlebars. It does not stop a tank slapper from starting. What it does is slow the oscillation down enough that a rider has a fighting chance of getting their hands back on the bars before the motorcycle spits them off. Suzuki also quietly updated the engine control unit for 1998 and later bikes. The new software retarded the ignition timing in first, second, and third gears, which had the effect of dropping the claimed peak horsepower from roughly 125 down to about 110. They also issued a second recall later for cracks appearing in the frame near where the rear shock assembly mounted. The TL1000S stayed in the Suzuki lineup until 2001, and then, without fanfare, it was gone. 4 years on the market, 2 major recalls, 1 confirmed fatality that anyone has been willing to discuss publicly, countless near misses nobody ever wrote down. Here is the part that turns this story from a single tragedy into an industry pattern. The TL1000s was not the only time a motorcycle press event got, shall we say, adjusted after the fact. In late 1999, Kawasaki was preparing the launch of the Ninja ZX-12R, a 1,199 cubic centimeter hyperbike widely understood to be aimed squarely at dethroning Suzuki's Hayabusa as the fastest production motorcycle on the planet. Kawasaki had been briefing journalists for months. The development target was widely reported at 320 kilometers per hour. The number, by the way, is literally stamped into the intake camshafts of every production ZX-12R that left the factory. Pre-production bikes had reportedly hit 197 miles per hour on a German test oval. A full worldwide press launch was booked, staged, and ready. Then, at the last possible minute, it was cancelled. What happened? The major European motorcycle manufacturers, staring down the threat of actual speed regulation, had just signed an informal agreement to cap their flagship bikes at 300 kilometers per hour. That's 186 miles per hour in American terms. Kawasaki hurriedly reflashed every press bike's engine control unit to restrict the top speed. They released the production ZX-12R with almost no fanfare or comment, and the advertised performance claims quietly got adjusted downward to match the new post-agreement reality. There is a fantastic footnote to the ZX-12R story that shows up, in plain English, right there in Cycle World's June 2000 road test of the bike. According to Mark Hoyer's write-up, during the period when international press bikes were being quietly handed out for review, a tester for the German motorcycle magazine Motorrad was doing a top-speed run on the Autobahn. Somewhere north of 180 miles per hour, the engine threw a connecting rod clean through the side of the crankcase. Kawasaki's response was immediate. Kawasaki Japan demanded that all press bikes be returned to distributors for safety inspection. Cycle World's own test was in the middle of a photo shoot when a Kawasaki representative walked up to the bike, stood by, and physically loaded it into a truck the moment the shoot wrapped. Photo shoot over. Story paused. Test report delayed until Kawasaki could confirm nothing else was going to explode at speed. When the final ZX-12R numbers eventually came out, Cycle World clocked the restricted bike at around 187 miles per hour, with the tachometer still showing 700 revolutions per minute of headroom in top gear. The bike was capable of more, a lot more. Independent testing later by the Muzzy Performance Shop recorded 192.3 miles per hour stock and 199.1 with an aftermarket exhaust. Those higher numbers were not part of the official launch narrative. Then there's Bimota. In 1997, the tiny Italian boutique manufacturer invited Alan Cathcart, one of the most respected English-language moto journalists alive, to ride the prototype of their new 500 cubic centimeter direct-injected two-stroke superbike called the V-Do. Cathcart declared that Bimota had essentially reinvented the sport motorcycle. Cycle World's October feature that same year praised the build quality, the acceleration, and the company's commitment to doing it right. There was a note about a fueling dead spot at 4,500 revolutions per minute. That note was treated as a minor quibble. Here is what the press wasn't told or didn't investigate hard enough. The prototype Cathcart rode used custom-machined Ferrari fuel injectors that Bimota simply could not source at production volume. The bikes that shipped to actual paying customers used mass market replacements, combined with crankcase seals that were not quite up to the job. The result was a production run of roughly 340 motorcycles, and according to Motorcycle News' own V-Do review page, of the approximately 15 V-Dos sold in Britain, about 12 were returned under warranty within a year. Bimota itself filed for bankruptcy in March of 2001. The glowing reviews had helped kill the company that built them. Now we come to the part of this story that has actual, on paper, in writing, court-admissible documentary evidence. Because everything up until now had been quiet pressure, inferred motivation, things everyone inside the industry knew, but nobody outside could prove. In 2009, that changed. A longtime contributing editor at the American magazine Motorcyclist, a man named Dexter Ford, had been investigating motorcycle helmet safety standards for several years. In 2005, he had written a massive feature for the magazine titled Blowing the Lid Off, which commissioned independent laboratory impact testing of cheap DOT-only helmets versus expensive Snell-certified models from Arai and Shuei. His finding was, to put it mildly, inconvenient. Some of the cheap helmets actually transmitted less impact force to a rider's head than the premium ones did. The Snell Foundation itself would, over the following years, adopt a materially softer testing standard, partly because of Ford's reporting. Then, in September of 2009, Ford wrote a follow-up piece for the New York Times about helmet standards, which pointed out some uncomfortable details about how the old Snell certification was being phased out. 2 weeks later, Ford was fired. The official termination letter accused him of personal vendettas. The official story was that this was an ordinary editorial decision. The unofficial story, it turned out, had a paper trail. The paper trail surfaced in July of 2010, roughly 9 months after Ford's firing. A cache of internal emails from Motorcyclist's editor-in-chief, a man named Brian Catterson, was leaked anonymously to a Norwegian motorcycle website called MC24. From there, the emails were picked up by Jalopnik, by the blog Hell for Leather, which would later become Ride Apart, and by the community at Metafilter. The messages were short. They were unambiguous. They were exactly what every rider had always suspected, but nobody outside the newsroom could prove. In one, sent at the end of September 2009, right after Ford's New York Times piece ran, Catterson warned Ford that the article was likely going to cost the magazine its Arai and Shuei advertising again, and wrote, "The wagons are already circling." A separate email dated 20 months earlier in January of 2008 showed that Catterson had already complained to Ford that a previous column of his had cost the magazine $100,000 in Arai and Shuei advertising. That, by Ford's own reading, was roughly what it cost a journalist to tell the truth about helmet safety. To Arai's credit, their public relations firm issued a formal denial of any involvement in Ford's termination. But the emails were the emails. Ford himself summed up what had happened in about 2 sentences. The magazine, he said, had let its advertisers dictate what got printed, what opinions were allowed about their products, and eventually, who was allowed to write for the magazine at all. So why does this keep happening? The short answer is structural. Motorcycle enthusiast magazines operate on extremely thin margins with tiny editorial staffs. Their advertising revenue depends almost entirely on a small cluster of companies: helmet brands, tire brands, exhaust manufacturers, and the bike companies themselves, who are also the only people who can put your riders on brand new machines in exotic locations. When an advertiser pulls $100,000 from your quarterly revenue, that is not a rounding error. That is somebody's salary, possibly somebody's whole department. Against that backdrop, asking a small magazine to aggressively investigate a helmet maker or publicly brand a new superbike a widowmaker is asking that magazine to make a genuinely painful financial decision. Some publications did it anyway. The British weeklies mostly did. Publications like Cycle World, over long enough timescales, mostly did. But the structural pressure to soften, to delay, to push a tough story into the back of the book, or to simply never commission it in the first place, is relentless. The journalism you read about dangerous motorcycles is not just reporting. It is the compromise that survived a dozen internal conversations you were never supposed to see. The most dangerous motorcycle review ever written was not a single article. It was a pattern of articles that did not quite get written the way they should have been. The warnings about the TL1000S that reportedly circulated inside Suzuki's European test department before the launch. The ZX12R top speed numbers buried under a gentleman's agreement. The VDO reliability questions that never got asked loudly enough. The helmet investigation that did get printed and got the journalist who wrote it fired for the trouble. Many of those stories are documented in recalls, in leaked emails, and in first-hand accounts. What is harder to see is the machinery that shaped how loudly any of them got told. If this is the kind of deep dive you want more of, the subscribe button is right there. We have got another story coming next week about a manufacturer you trust completely and a recall you almost certainly never heard about. We'll see you then.